Hey, Al, Scott Horton here. It's always safe to say that one should keep at least some of your savings in precious metals as a hedge against inflation. And if this economy ever does heat back up and the banks start expanding credit, rising prices could make metals a very profitable bet. Since 1977, Robertson Roberts Brokerage Inc. has been helping people buy and sell gold, silver, platinum, and palladium, and they do it well. They're fast, reliable, and trusted for more than 35 years. And they take Bitcoin. Call Robertson Roberts at 1-800-874-9760 or stop by rrbi.co. All right, y'all, Scott Horton Show. I'm him. ScottHorton.org is the website. Full interview archive there. More than 4,000 interviews going back to 2003 at ScottHorton.org. Follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. Introducing Shane Bauer, the heroic Shane Bauer, senior reporter at Mother Jones Magazine. You remember it made the news when his cameraman got busted out in front of a prison in Louisiana back a few months ago, almost a year ago, I guess, or maybe more. And then it came out that, well, Mother Jones had an undercover reporter inside that prison. And that's what was going on. And then we were not surprised to find out that it was the great Shane Bauer. And this is basically a book, although I'm not trying to scare you off of it. You can sit and read it in one sitting, no problem. It's called My 4 Months as a Private Prison Guard, a Mother Jones investigation. It is at motherjones.com. And it's basically 5 chapters. It's a pretty good, I don't know how many, 200 something page book here, something like that. Welcome back to the show, Shane. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Really great work that you've done here, man.
Thank you.
Gotta congratulate you on that. So I guess first thing is just tell us overall, what is CCA? How did you decide you wanted to do this report, et cetera, like that?
CCA is the Corrections Corporation of America. It's a company that's traded on Wall Street, a company that brings in $1.9 billion in revenue every year. It has been running prisons since the 80s. It has there's over 60 prisons that it operates. There's another company that is a close competitor called the Geo Group, is doing the same kind of thing. And you know, I've been reporting on prisons for a few years now, and the prisons in general in the United States are very hard to get information from. The walls kind of function in both directions, keeping people in, but also keeping outsiders out. And, you know, when you do get inside, it's usually for kind of scripted tours, and information you get is through spokespeople. And this is especially true with private prisons. They're especially secretive. A lot of public access laws don't apply because they are not public institutions. They're private companies. So we haven't seen much about life inside of these prisons. We hear about them in the news every once in a while. If there's a riot, there was some years back, there was a CCA prison in Idaho that was closed down after an FBI investigation that found that it was severely understaffed and that there was higher levels of violence as a result. So I thought that this was the only way to really look up close and see what's going on. So I put in an application.
Right on. Well, and it's kind of funny. Oh, and by the way, for people who just can't stand to read, and there are people who they're out for whatever reasons, they just can't stand to read. There's a 6-part video series that goes along with this report as
right,
well.
And
so if you're not going to read it, oh, go ahead.
There's also a radio documentary that was we produced with Reveal that's an hour long.
Oh, okay. I missed that part of it.
Find that on iTunes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. So yeah, nobody, even if it's just, you know, a matter of time, whatever, you can listen, on your way to work, later on to that full hour thing. You can check out the video series on YouTube, et cetera. Yeah, so now, I guess I'm trying to figure out the most important, well, what do you think is the real bottom line difference between a government-run prison and a government-contracted prison?
Well, first of all, I don't want to give the impression that, you know, government-run prisons are, you know, somehow running smoothly. That's not the case. I mean, we have a lot of issues inside the prison system in the U.S. right now, but these private prisons have a particular set of issues that kind of spring from this tension between, having the job of providing care and keeping prisoners safe and turning a profit. So what I saw happen at Winn was there were a lot of corners cut in order to save money. 60% of the cost of running a prison is in staffing. So when you have less staff, less programs, you save money. And at Winn, these guards were making $9 an hour, barely above what people were making at the Walmart in town. So, there's a lot of turnover. People start the job and they realize that it's really stressful and dangerous and it's not worth it, and they quit. You have guards bringing in a lot of contraband to make some extra money. And there's just a general sense of frustration amongst guards and prisoners. And, because the morale is so low and there's just not enough staff. And when I say that, when I'm talking about staff, I'm talking, there were days that there were 24, 25 guards for 1,500 prisoners. So it leads to violence because there are not guards doing security checks, just getting the homemade weapons out and stuff like that, the kind of normal work of prison. So I saw stabbings. There were many stabbings while I was there. And I also found later, after leaving the prison and doing public records requests with the Department of Corrections, that it appeared that CCA was not reporting all of these stabbings as they're supposed to. So there was a 2-month period where I noted 12 stabbings, and in the 10-month period that overlapped that, CCA reported 5 stabbings to the Department of Corrections. Mm-hmm. So, that was just an example of how, if I hadn't taken this approach and I tried to find out, what are the levels of how violent is this prison compared to other ones, it would be impossible to know. If it's not being reported, then the numbers don't mean anything.
Right. Well, and that level of dishonesty is evident throughout the article, too, where it's clear, and as you explain at the end, that you gave them every opportunity to respond, and their denials are pretty pathetic and pretty paper thin when it comes down to it. And all throughout the article, over and over again, you're reporting facts that you saw with your own eyes, or you have multiple credible sources, say, for example, on the staff there, and then in parentheses, CCA said this never happened, or whatever it is. All throughout. They seem like they could maybe invest a little bit more in their public relations and try to come up with some plausible deniability instead of just blanket denials. But anyway.
Yeah, I reached out to them. I wanted to interview someone from the corporate headquarters in person, but they declined. So there was a long process of just emailing them questions. I sent them over 150 questions, and it was important for me to have their side in the story. But this was happening at the same time, around the same time that our lawyers are also sending each other letters back and forth. CCA, found out that I had been working there, and they warned Mother Jones that if it published an article by me, then there could be legal consequences. Mm.
Well, I'm sure that Mother Jones was just terrified and hadn't even considered that when they sent you in there in the first place, right?
Yeah, but we were very, very careful, and part of why we spent so much time on this story after I left, just making sure that everything was rock solid. We fact-checked this thing to an inch of its life, and our lawyers looked at it very closely just to make sure that we're doing everything right.
Yeah. Hey, and as it should be. Why not, right? And,
exactly.
Their pressure that you better not screw up in this piece or else they'll sue you is a great way to make sure that your piece comes out just perfect, which It seems to have worked really well here. So good. Now, I saw a headline here. This doesn't come up in the piece, but I saw a headline somewhere, Shane, that said, and by the way, audience, if you're not familiar, Shane was famously one of the hikers imprisoned in Iran. In solitary for quite some time, a few years there, right?
Yeah, I was in Iran for 2 years in prison, and 4 months of that was total solitary confinement. The rest of the time I was in a cell with one other person, but isolated from, the rest of the world, essentially.
And then the headline I saw was you were comparing your experience in Louisiana with the prison in Iran. Can you tell us about it?
I think it's hard to compare these two situations. They're very different. One I was a prisoner, one I was a guard, and the prisons themselves are very different. But the prison I was in Iran was kind of an example of a very tightly and maybe over-controlled prison. I was in a cell. I wasn't allowed to interact with anybody else. And the prison at Winn was kind of the exact opposite of that. It was, prisoners living in open dorms of 45 people. It was very chaotic. There was no real sense of control. Prisoners would always say to me, inmates run this prison. And, but it wasn't as if they were kind of, collectively organizing the prison. It was, that meant that people who were kind of, predators ended up running the prison. They ended up having a lot more power.
Well, and yeah, you talk a lot about, as far as the black market and their own separate money system and all that, most of that corner store running around, making sure everybody has their smokes and Twizzlers and all that. That doesn't sound so bad. But then you describe pretty much officially sanctioned sexual slavery as well.
Yeah. This is pervasive throughout the prison system. There were people at Winn that were called punks, and that essentially was somebody who, was sexually subservient to usually one other man. And, usually it's a very complicated situation. It's hard to generalize, because the nature of these relationships, are diverse, but, usually that person is essentially controlled. And there was I did see the effects of the Prisoner Rape Elimination Act. There was fear amongst staff and guards of violating that act, which is a good thing because, they're afraid of getting sued, basically. And so, overt rape was not tolerated at the prison, but this more systemic dynamic of these kind of people that are, in a sense, in sexual bondage was basically accepted among staff and prisoners.
Man. And then I don't want to delve too far off the subject into why we must legalize prostitution immediately or anything, but you tell the story of this woman, I guess, China.
Right.
That, I just thought, if anybody read just this part of the story, and the context was, does that seem fair? Like that's what should happen to someone for being a prostitute? That they should have to go to prison for years and have to suffer through this kind of, what is this? Yeah. It's insane.
Yeah, that was really a sad story. And the way that I found out about that story was in training when a guard was teaching us a class about, I think it was inmate manipulation. And he was giving us examples of how inmates manipulate guards, how they, get them to do things, how sometimes prisoners will get guards to do things that will get them in trouble. And he was saying that there was a guard at Winn who an inmate had, pressured into giving him a blowjob. And when I looked into, and the guard ended up going to prison. So I looked into the case, and it was a very different story. It was a transgender inmate who was a sex worker in New Orleans who had, was arrested for it and had, a multiple year sentence and ended up at Winn. And, this guard started, pressuring her to giving him sexual favors a couple of times, and under the threat of solitary confinement if she didn't. And there was one time that she he made her give him a blowjob, and she essentially saved the semen in her mouth, spit it out onto her shirt, and got it into the hands of the FBI. They did a DNA test and found out, who it was. So he was arrested, but she was immediately shipped off to another prison and kept in total solitary confinement until she got out of prison.
Yeah, and then you have the quote too. Well, I don't want to ruin it, but the real point was that was it in this prison previously, back when they had some rehabilitation program, she was working, learning how to be a mechanic. And this was the end of all of that. And she said, I wish I had just gone ahead and let him get away with it instead of standing up for myself, because the consequences were even worse.
Yeah, and she thought, at least when I got out of prison, I'd have some certificate that I could use to get a job. And she's, it's not easy for poor trans people who have been in prison to get by when they get out. It's a very, really an uphill struggle. And she felt that if she at least had this one piece of paper, maybe she would have been okay. But instead she wound up in solitary confinement and got out and went back to sex work.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I'm amazed actually at my own ignorance here. I guess if you'd asked me, I don't know if I'd even thought about it. If you'd asked me, I would have said that for prostitution, maybe you go to the county lockup for 30 days or something.
Right.
But people get years in prison just for getting caught on one act of prostitution?
Yeah, Louisiana is especially harsh. Across the board, really. It has the highest rate of incarceration on the planet. And in Louisiana, the crime that she was actually convicted of was crime against nature.
Oh,
that's still a law that's on the books in Louisiana.
Yeah, man. All right, now talk to me about medical care here. Everybody, get prepared to freak out.
So right when I started, actually the first time that I entered the prison, we were taken to the gym for an inmate graduation. People were graduating from different programs, and I met a guy who was in a wheelchair, and he told me that it was just that year that he lost his legs and fingers to gangrene. And he told me that he was going to the infirmary saying my feet hurt, and they were just saying to him that he was faking it, and were giving him, some Motrin and sending him back. And he is suing the prison. So I dug up his case and found, a good amount of records, looked at his medical records and saw that at least 9 times he had requested to see a doctor and was denied. And he was essentially ignored, and he eventually had to have his legs amputated after they were oozing with pus. And I also met, there was one time when I was working that a man kind of was just writhing on his bed in intense pain, and I found out that he had just been to the infirmary where prisoners said that they told him he had fluid in his lungs, and he was just sent back to his unit. So he goes to the infirmary again. He's back within a couple hours, and he kept asking to go to the hospital, and he couldn't get to the hospital. And there were many examples of this kind of thing. CCA, if they send a prisoner out to a hospital, they have to bear that expense. So they're bringing in $34 per inmate per day. Taking them to a hospital is going to be a huge expense when you compare it to what they're actually making from a prisoner. This is something, afterwards that I saw countless lawsuits about, in different CCA prisons, the lack of appropriate medical care. And in some states, go ahead.
Back to the whole thing about just the incentive structure of running having a corporation run a system like this. Did they not even, is it as though they didn't even think of this, that this could be a huge disincentive for this corporation to provide medical treatment for its inmates, which is absolutely necessary, and that maybe they could have the state pick up those costs, or they could come up with a way that it's not so obviously designed to deprive people of care?
It does seem like common sense.
But yeah, so the answer is no. The answer is nope. That's just how it is. Tough.
There were also, I found out later, a bunch of doctors who had worked at Winn who had histories of medical malpractice. I looked into, their backgrounds, and a lot of them had been hired after being disciplined by the state medical board for anything from selling drugs to, there was one who, had some kind of malpractice issue with working with children.
Yeah, well, and apparently they just refuse to even show up and do their job at all, right? I mean, you talk about people just asking for a doctor and just not ever getting one. Sounds like probably most of that is because they're not even at work.
Yeah, I mean, there weren't many doctors, and at that, right before we shipped this story off to be printed in a magazine, the Department of Corrections turned over to me some correspondence that it had with CCA that basically showed how the state was coming after CCA and the issues that it had with how CCA was running the prison, and essentially corroborated the issues that I brought up in the story. And one of the points was that there's not enough medical staff. They're not meeting their contract requirements with medical staff or security staff or mental health staff. There were also the state said that CCA had been charging prisoners for state-issued toilet paper and toothpaste. They were charging them to clip their nails. I mean, some of this stuff, it's like you can't, you try to imagine what it would be like if a company ran a prison, and I would never think, these guys are charging people to clip their toenails.
Yeah. Well, and I think, on the average day, people are glad that the worst criminals are locked up behind bars or whatever, but they also probably don't imagine that the prisons are so understaffed that they just keep the guys on lockdown for 24 hours a day indefinitely, at least from time to time, just because they don't have the staff. And how, if you gotta be in prison, you gotta be allowed to walk around somewhere, do something other than sit.
Some kind of, rehabilitative, program, some way to come out better than you went in. I mean, those programs have been cut over the years from CCA, from cost cutting. There were a handful of programs, like Cage Your Rage and AA and stuff like that. But there's also, the question of security for the people who live around these prisons. There was a man who escaped while I was there who just hopped over the fence in the middle of the day, and he was in view of guard towers, but there were no guards in the towers. So nobody saw him escape. They didn't find out for hours that this guy had escaped. The perimeter alarm went off in the control room, and the person working there just turned it off and went back to whatever she was doing. I mean, it's this kind of sense of, just kind of this slipshod approach. And you have a man running through the woods, out of this prison. Yeah.
Now, I wonder, among the prisoners, and you say in the article that you never did find out, I guess, what a lot of the different guys were in for, but did it seem like there were pretty much distinctions between people who really were career criminals or just really violent, dangerous men versus people who had really screwed up and done something bad one time versus people who were just convicted of being a drug businessman or, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it was hard for me to know, I usually didn't know the crimes of individuals, but I do know that I think 55% of the prisoners at Winn are in for violent crimes, and the rest, are a mix of drug crimes and other crimes. There were people who were in there for murder, people that were in there for having too many DUIs. And, that was one of the kind of psychological challenges as a guard is, you don't know every person that you're interacting with. You don't really know what they're there for, what their motives are. I mean, you start to kind of get a sense of if somebody's just trying to play you and try to get something from you versus somebody just, having conversation with you as a human being. But I mean, when you're in that position, that's a power position, but it's also really, I found a pretty powerless position. Your mind really starts to play tricks on you. And I mean, towards the end of my experience there, I was I mean, I ended up having to leave because my colleague got arrested, but I was really thinking just literally that week about whether I should leave because it was really getting to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you talk in the article about the Stanford prison experiment and how
Yep.
here you are in the position of a guard. And after all, you got to keep yourself safe, which means
Right.
not just you have to be willing to kill one of these guys if you have to stay alive, but also you have to let them know basically at all times that you're willing to, that you're that tough.
Right.
That's a hell of a position to put yourself in there, Shane.
Yeah, I mean, that's really everybody in prison is in that position. I got in there, when I went there, I was stationed in a unit with 350 prisoners. There was me and just one other officer working the floor in that unit. And I really was making a point of, having a really good relationship with everybody, with all the prisoners in there. But, that didn't last very long. Didn't take long for somebody to try to take advantage of me or push me over. And that's the worst thing that can happen in prison, no matter who you are. So, I had to decide what my line was and stand behind it. And once you do that, then you start to have conflicts with people, and it becomes a very, very complex web of power that, really after I'd been there for a little while, I was spending most of my energy to navigate, to figure out how just to make it through that, when I had all of these people, more and more people as time went on that I was having conflicts with. And it's a really hard thing to navigate.
Yeah, must be. Well, and, like they say, from all their psych tests and everything, you're a pretty unique character to be in a place like that. Most of these guards, I mean, I don't know, not the ones you made best friends with, but the other ones are a bunch of meathead idiots anyway, who could just as easily be on the other side of the bars. And they're the ones who got to figure out how to navigate this. And I assume
Right.
they're not quite as subtle as you in figuring out what to do.
Yeah, I mean, I was, obviously different. I'm a journalist who was going in there to try to see what the conditions were like and that kind of thing. But I do think that, among the cadets that I was with in training, I think most, if not all of them, had an idea that they were going to be good guards. They were good people. They weren't in there. They weren't sadists or anything like that. But everybody goes through a transformation once they're in there. I mean, the reality is you can't lock up hundreds of people day in and day out and see them as equals, because it'll just, it's too difficult to do that psychologically. So either you end up quitting and realizing this job sucks and I can't do this, or you turn that part of yourself off. The guards that stay end up having to turn that part off. And some of them become cruel, some don't. But they're not the same people they were when they went in. We actually took a personality test in training called True Colors, and it essentially tells you what your dominant traits are. And mine was I was a green, which is kind of the color for people who are analytical and curious. And the head of training said that most people were gold, which is rule oriented, kind of by the book types. And she said that she found that over time, people's dominant color shifted when they were in that prison, and people would tend to become golds over time.
Yeah, as a matter of necessity, right? So now, reading this thing, some of the time I think, I don't know, if you got to be a prisoner, it'd probably be okay to have a bunch of lazy stoner guards who don't do their job, sit around and let you, more or less get away with murder. But then, whoops, what happens is they start getting away with murder. And you talk
Right.
about the violence just spiraling completely out of control. And you weren't on the worst block out of the 4 or 5, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I don't think a lot of prisoners are really mad that drugs can get in the prison or that they can get away with smoking. I mean, if I had to be in a prison, those might not be the worst things, but the problem is, that the prison is really dangerous. And there was, you see there's a kind of a downward spiral that happens where once you have some prisoners making shanks, these kind of homemade knives, then to attack people, then some prisoners feel like they need them to protect themselves. And the prison becomes armed. The prison becomes violent. And it's this kind of, just chaotic violence. It's just like, people who are violent end up ruling. And there were lots of stabbings while I was there. The company eventually sent in its kind of tactical team from around the country to sweep through the prison. And I later found from records requests with the Department of Corrections that in the first 2 months of 2015, there were around 200 weapons found in the prison. That is 23 times more than the number of weapons found at Angola prison, which is the maximum security prison in Louisiana.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a huge, huge number of knives to be in a prison.
Well, and then you talk about how once things get that far out of control, then they bring in the SORT team, which is
that's who I'm talking about.
Yeah,
this kind of SWAT-like team. And then the state took over because, the state started keeping an eye on the prison because there was an escape, because there's so many stabbings. And so one day they just show up with guards from around the state and wardens. And they essentially just take over the prison for a while, and, try to show CCA how to run it. And, I talked to some wardens at that time, and one of them just said to me, "This place is a joke." He just couldn't believe what he was seeing. And this is Louisiana. I mean, this is not some paragon of prison reform. I mean, all Louisiana is notorious for having very problematic prisons.
Yeah. As you said, the highest rate of incarceration on the planet.
Exactly.
Unbelievable. Okay, and now, look, we're actually a little over time, but I want to ask you one more. If you could tell the story about the guy that I think you say you had met right at the very beginning who ended up committing suicide at the end. That seemed like, maybe a good way to wrap this up.
I actually wrote a separate story about this prisoner that's going to be up soon on motherjones.com, so look out for that. But this guy, my first day on the job, I was stationed on Suicide Watch, which is in the segregation unit. Suicide Watch essentially is solitary confinement. If somebody says they're suicidal, they get put in a cell alone without clothes. They're given a tear-proof blanket, and they're not allowed to have anything in their cell. No mattress. They sleep on a metal bunk. No reading material. And they're also given worse food than the rest of the prison. They get a brown bag lunch with a bologna sandwich, a peanut butter sandwich, and some carrot celery sticks. And the nutritional value of these meals is below USDA standards. And I was stationed there. There's no, mental health staff stationed there whatsoever. So my job is to sit in front of a cell and watch the person on Suicide Watch and kind of note every 15 minutes what they're doing. And this one of the people I was watching was Damian Costley. He said he was really didn't want me there, sitting there, and he said, if you don't get out of here, I'm going to jump off this bed and break my neck. And he said he was having a mental health emergency, which I was required to report, and I did. And it was about 6 hours until a psychiatrist showed up to talk to him. After I left Winn, I learned that Damian committed suicide, and he had been on Suicide Watch and was taken off Suicide Watch by the SWAT team, which is against policy. The only people that can actually take a prisoner off Suicide Watch is mental health staff. But said the SWAT team who was running the unit took him off, put him in a cell with another man who was severely mentally ill. And inmates that I contacted later told me that they had heard Damian tell sword officer that he was suicidal and that he needed to go back on suicide watch. They did not put him back on suicide watch, and he hung himself in the afternoon. I spoke to staff who had investigated the suicide later, and they said that the guards are required to go up and down the tiers every half hour to check on people. They weren't doing that. And he was sent to a hospital where he was alive but brain dead for 20 days. And the thing about Damien is that he was filing a lot of complaints, which I later looked at, about mental health services. He was complaining about the mental health services at Winn. He was also complaining about diet. He was going on hunger strike regularly to try to change these things. And he went on suicide watch a lot. And when he died, his autopsy said that he weighed 71 pounds.
71 pounds.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, audience, just remember try to think back. How old were you the last time you weighed 71 pounds? Elementary school, right?
Yeah.
Elementary school. And this is the thing about this whole damn article, right? Is, I know my rights. I want some redress. You can't, we're in prison, but you can't treat us like this. And yet, yeah, they can't. The complaints, as you say, they just go on a pile. There's no accountability here.
Yeah, I mean, this story, the story of Damien is one example of something that, I mean, nobody would ever hear anything about this person normally.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, how often does this kind of thing happen?
Right.
We don't know.
Shane Bauer, man, you're an American hero. You're a hell of a journalist. Seriously,
you.
This is great work, and I really appreciate what you do, and especially for giving us some time on this show to talk about it too.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, y'all. That is the great Shane Bauer. You can find him. He is senior reporter at Mother Jones Magazine. You can find this at motherjones.com. My 4 months as a private prison guard, a Mother Jones investigation. Again, there is an hour-long podcast interview with the producers, others over there at Mother Jones, and there is a 6-part YouTube series. He had a secret camera in his watch and a secret microphone in his pen, and he got was consulting with his producers and cohorts all through. So there's a great 6-part documentary to watch, and this article itself is a monograph. It's a book in its own right, 5 chapters long at motherjones.com. My 4 months as a private prison guard. That's the Scott Horton Show. Sign up for the podcast feed at scotthorton.org. Check out the archives there, more than 4,000 of them. Help support at scotthorton.org/donate, and follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. Hey, all, Scott Horton here to tell you about this great new ebook by longtime Future Freedom author Scott McPherson. Freedom and Security, the Second Amendment and the Right to Keep and Bear Arms. This is the definitive principled case in favor of gun rights and against gun control. America is exceptional. Here the people come first, and we refuse to allow the state a monopoly on firearms. Our liberty depends on it. Get Scott McPherson's Freedom and Security, the Second Amendment and the Right to Keep and Bear Arms on Kindle at Amazon.com today. Hey, y'all, Scott Horton here for WallStreetWindow.com. Mike Swanson knows his stuff. He made a killing running his own hedge fund and always gets out of the stock market before the government-generated bubbles pop, which is, by the way, what he's doing right now, selling all his stocks and betting on gold and commodities. Sign up at WallStreetWindow.com and get real-time updates from Mike on all his market moves. It's hard to know how to protect your savings and earn a good return in an economy like this. Mike Swanson can help. Follow along on paper and see for yourself. WallStreetWindow.com. Hey, all, Scott Horton here to tell you about this great new book by Michael Swanson, The War State. In The War State, Swanson examines how Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy both expanded and fought to limit the rise of the new national security state after World War II. If this nation is ever to live up to its creed of liberty and prosperity for everyone, we are going to have to abolish the empire. Know your enemy. Get The War State by Michael Swanson. It's available at your local bookstore or at Amazon.com in Kindle or in paperback. Just click the book in the right margin at scotthorton.org or thewarstate.com.